Welcome to the Kuyperian Commentary Podcast. This is episode 142, and I have with me Jon Harris. Jon is the host of the Conversations That Matter podcast. He writes for American Reformer. He has a master's degree in history from Liberty University, and I believe an MDiv from Southern Seminary, right?
Southeastern Seminary, yeah.
Southeastern Seminary. Okay, welcome to the podcast. Glad to have you on.
Thanks, Rick. I appreciate it. It's good to talk with you. We know we've talked in person, and I think we've emailed back and forth a little bit, and it's good to be on this podcast with you.
Yeah, I think the first contact I had with you was years ago. I read your book, Sacred Conviction, The South Stand for Biblical Authority, which I thought was a really great short book, and I still keep it on my Kindle for reference if I need to pull up quotes. Good source there. So yeah, it's good to be able to talk to you here. One thing I wanted to talk to you about, and the reason I had you on, I recently watched the 1607 Project, which was a wonderful documentary. I should put a link to it down below. And it's also a website. I had, well, mine's going blank here right now. Zachary Garris. I had him on the podcast a few weeks ago to talk about something separate, his new book, but the 1607 Project came up on that because he's actually in the documentary. So the big push of that, well, why don't I set it up this way? Why don't I kind of set up the conversation with a quote? I'll let you respond to the quote, and we can go from there. So in 1863, November 19th, Abraham Lincoln said, 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. How do you respond to that famous quote by Abraham Lincoln?
Well, the 1607 Project, there's a book and there's also the documentary, of course. The book goes into more detail, but the way that myself and some other historians and scholars have tried to approach this is understanding the context of the time, what Lincoln was trying to do with that, and then from Lincoln, what this created. So the context of the time, obviously, the United States was engulfed in a war, and Lincoln wanted to, I mean, he did this a number of times, but he obviously wanted to preserve the Union by any means necessary, really. And so by appealing to this broad idea that the United States was founded on this very, very basic idea of equality, he could kind of justify what he was doing, why the South needed to be kept in the Union. He believed that the Union preceded the states. So the states, he rejected what we call today compact theory. I think it's compact fact, but he rejected that and believed the Union was this perpetual entity that, I mean, you hear this in the battle, not the battle hymn, but the, one of the famous Civil War songs. They just did it at a Kamala Harris rally, actually, the battle cry of freedom, the Union forever. The Union forever. And so he talks about that even in the Gettysburg Address, that this is this perpetual thing, and it's kind of a revolutionary notion at that point. This is not something the founders would have agreed with him on in general. You can try to cherry pick little things here or there, but it's a twisting of the purpose of the Declaration of Independence to try to suit his political agenda, and from there it ends up being the justification that mostly progressives, but you still have some Republican progressive administrations using it to support things like the war in Iraq, or gender affirming policies, for supposed transgenders. It was used by Barack Obama when it came to the gay marriage issue, and so this was something that you see since then as kind of like a very amiable, very pliable kind of justification that you can just insert into any political issue. And as long as it's about liberty, then that's what America's about. And so if you oppose it, you're not really an American. You could really create a list of friends and enemies, and kind of wield that American identity in your favor when you have something that general.
Right. And now, just to be clear, the idea here, and I've heard it said this way many times, is that America is the only country in the world founded on a creed,
Right.
a common creed or a common idea versus a people. And that's sort of the proposition nation idea that you see from Lincoln coming up in
They call it
modern
the
times.
creedal nation sometimes too. So you proposition nation, creedal nation, the same thing. I like to go back to, for the Republicans at least, because this infiltrates more conservative circles and in the Republican Party today. It's also unquestioned. But there's a speech Mitt Romney gave. You might remember this in 2012. And Mitt Romney was trying to defend against those who would look at him a little sideways because he was a Mormon. And so he wanted to justify his American credentials and the fact that your religion shouldn't really matter when you enter public office. We have a religious heritage, but we have a common creed that's more important. And that's what all Americans are bound by. They're bound together because of a common creed, not because of a common religion. And so, in effect, what he's doing is, and he's not the first one, obviously, but he is tapping into this civic religion that
Right.
I mean, the left complains about this a lot. They say that the right has a civic religion. They just can't see that they're the worst abusers of that. They advocate it more than the right does. But they're correct. There is a civic religion, and you see it all the time. You see it in January 6th when Nancy Pelosi said that the unwashed masses essentially came into the quote temple of democracy. Using religious language,
Right.
um, and democracy is this very sacred thing, but it's not really even literal democracy that they're defending. It's something else. There's something behind that. And when you peel back all the onion layers, it really comes down to this notion of equality, this emancipation narrative of history, that we're coming into greater and greater levels of equality as we roll back some of the archaic institutions, divine right of kings, arranged marriages, women not being allowed to participate in government, slavery, feudalism, these kinds of things. So yeah, I mean, I think. Go ahead.
Yeah, this is also what Reno calls, I think, the open society in his book Return of the Strong Gods, which
Yes.
you might be familiar with. The idea
Yeah,
that
yeah. I read
more
that.
and
It's a good
more
book.
openness growing and growing, sort of eschatological utopia coming our way from openness and equality.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think that's correct. And he's probably it's been a little while since I read that, but I'm imagining he's appealing back to I'm trying to remember his name now. It should be on the tip of my tongue, but the guy that really inspired George Soros, the guy, the
Right.
first one to really use the term open societies. And it's gonna come to me in a minute, but
I don't remember
yeah,
his name either, but the book was The Open Society and Its Enemies.
that's right. That's
My brain doesn't
absolutely right.
have the name, though.
Yeah. So, yeah, I think that the open society is a parallel, certainly. And in Europe, you see the same problems we have in the United States, you have in Europe, sometimes to a greater extent. England right now is going through a terrible time, and they're losing their British identity. Ireland's even starting to lose its Irish identity, and it's extremely disconcerting for people who have given and sacrificed for generations to make England what it is. And now all of that's coming to ruin. And it's because England has also become, in a sense, a proposition nation. Now, they still have these symbolic things, like they have a king and a queen, but they don't have much authority. And they have the Church of England is their official state church, but that doesn't really mean anything anymore. And so they have adopted this notion that England is, what they're really about is they are the ones who defeated the Nazis in World War II. And I think since that time, this is where we get into the post-war consensus, that has become the major identity marker for many European countries too, that especially allied countries, that they stood against this evil regime. And this evil regime is defined by an excess and too much of an enthusiasm for their own nation. And so in doing that, they've forfeited their own nation. They forfeited their own borders, their own culture, their own language, their own religion, and they've made way for others to come. And when you have Muslims coming, they fill the gap in ways that they're not going to agree with you on liberal society principles. They're not going to say, yeah, England's a proposition nation. England is about equality and freedom. And they don't care about any of that. So they come in and they bring their country and they just plant it there. And now you have a two-tiered police system, and that's inescapable because you have two countries living side by side. And America's having the same problems. I was just in Minneapolis, and they've imported a number of Muslims there, and they're running into so many problems. And even those who come from Latin America, Catholic countries, since our 1965 Immigration Act, that's accelerated, since the Biden administration, that's really accelerated, and they don't quite fit in many of the places that they're going, and they don't speak the same language, don't have the same values necessarily, and it creates real problems culturally, economically, and so I think it's a big deal. Like the proposition nation is used to justify all these things, and we should probably question it and start asking, where did this notion come from? No society in the history of the world, really, or I should say, no nation has adopted this as their identity marker. You could try to come up with examples like the Roman Empire, but that was an empire, and they did have, special privileges for Romans. You could say that the Old Testament, Israel, maybe they had, because they had a law, and you had foreigners who could adopt this law at certain aspects of it, and there was some ability to integrate and that kind of thing. But you still had walls around your cities. You still had certain things that they weren't able to do, and that those who were Jewish could do. And so there was still this recognition that they were foreigners, and that's what we've eliminated. We have eliminated that recognition. So you don't have a distinction between natives and foreigners anymore with this proposition nation stuff.
Right. Do you think that's, and I'm spitballing here because I hadn't thought of this until you were talking just now, it came into my head, the idea that if we're based on a creed, then rather than being a nation, we're a religion with our own Great Commission, right? Spread Americanism, spread democracy to the world. And the church is universal, right? The church, as instituted by Christ, is based on a creed. It's based on the gospel, and it's universal. It transcends nations. I think there's even confusion there for Christians who think, because I'm a Christian and because the church transcends nations, therefore my nation should somehow transcend nations. My political nation ought to welcome all the foreigners, all the immigrants, because the church does, because the church is universal in that way.
Yeah.
Do you see that as a category confusion that happens for Christians when we're talking about these issues?
Oh, definitely. Yeah, that's one of the reasons I say the United States, and many others say, that was founded on Anglo-Protestantism. It's not, Christianity is universal, but when it plants itself in a country, it will adopt certain, like, for example, we have hymnals at my church, right? So, and they're in English, the words that we sing, down to the way we dress, the way we greet each other, the way that the seats are arranged, and the buildings, how they look, all of it is somewhat specific to our context. So there's a uniqueness there. And yes, we are practicing a universal religion, but if you were to, go into, let's say, Nigeria, we were going to worship with Nigerian brothers and sisters in Christ, it's going to look a whole lot different. And we're practicing the same exact religion.
Right.
So I think we can recognize that even with something as universal as Christianity, the way that it manifests itself, the way that we practice it, is going to vary in certain cultural ways. And that's fine. That's perfectly fine.
Right.
And in the United States, our identity has never been a universal Christianity. Even when we talk about a Christian founding, we're talking about a uniquely, really English founding with some, on the periphery, there's definitely some other Protestant groups. You have, I think, one Catholic who signed the Declaration of Independence. If you want to claim, I think it was Charles Carroll, if I'm not mistaken. Carroll was the last name. I don't remember if Charles was the first, but so you do have some So it's sort of like a pan-Protestantism, but it was primarily an English / British Isles endeavor. And that form of Christianity was really what took root and has set the default for a long time. And so if you adopt a proposition nation, even if you try to filter it through some kind of a universal Christianity, you get rid of those distinctions as well. And doesn't matter if you have other immigrant groups coming here who are, as long as they're Christians, it's always fine, but they could be totally different. They could, in many ways. I mean, look at even in our own country, we have a widespread with black churches tend to be Protestant. Black people don't tend to be Catholics, right? But you look at the way, because when I was in Lynchburg, I remember I went to a black church, and it was beautiful. But they have a very different way of approaching preaching and all kinds of things, and so I think focusing on particularity and what makes people unique, distinct, and truly valuable, because it takes generations to build those things up, is where we probably, at this point at least, need to focus our attention, and less so on a proposition nation that just allows everyone in, and you don't have to have any experience here, and you're just as American as anyone else. That doesn't make any sense.
Right. Even Catholics, growing up in Virginia, sort of in the Bible Belt area, I knew Catholics. I had a couple Catholic friends growing up, and if you listen to them talk about the gospel, they sounded really Protestant.
I know.
And that's because for 10 generations, their family has been in Virginia, and the Catholics here. When you bring in South American Catholics, it's not the same. It's very, very different worldview, way of speaking about the gospel, everything like that. I want to talk before I think we've got plenty of time here, but I wanted to move on a little bit and talk about the alternative, because if the idea that America is a creed or a nebulous proposition nation is not the case, and I'll definitely be pointing people to the 1607 book and documentary in the notes for this show, so they can go follow up on that. What's the alternative, and where do we see that within the political realm today, or do we? Has that been pushed sort of out of the public discourse entirely at this point?
So the 1607 Project argues that Virginia was the headwaters for the rest of the country, being the first English settlement, permanent settlement. And they brought with them their English institutions and ways of doing things, including Christianity. And they, throughout time, as they developed, they brought with them the first legislature, elected legislature, was 1619. And that's probably more significant than the indentured servants likely indentured servants that came to Virginia that the 1619 Project wants to focus on. But that was the first elected assembly in the present United States, what we call that today. They brought with them representative government. They brought with them music that has developed and created all kinds of interesting sounds that are uniquely American today. They brought with them their cuisine. They brought with them their military tradition, which has really been that cavalier kind of culture has really gotten us through many wars and produced some very fine institutions and generals. And so we focus on all of these different things in the project. We focus a lot on preachers and the way that Christianity spread, and even the popular religion on the frontier, and slaves who came into the faith because of missionary efforts by people like Samuel Davies there in Virginia. So we see Virginia as a very important state, and having an outsized influence on the beginnings of what became the United States. So they, during a very, I would say, important time in the development of a person, right? That's when they're a child. And Virginia supplied most of the presidents up until Abraham Lincoln. Virginia supplied the first Supreme Court justice. Most of the elected officials that were of any important rank in the executive branch tended to be from Virginia. So we want to focus on that and get back to our identity there. And it doesn't mean that other regions don't also have significant contributions, because they do. And so we don't want to neglect that, but we think that ultimately and this is more of a theological thing, I suppose, but a country and it is really composed of a people that exist in a particular place. And so 1607 Project really just talks about that. These are the kinds of people that came here. This is the place they inhabited and how it shaped them. And that's what it is to be an American.
Right. So would you say the propositional nation is on the ballot this November?
So, yeah, to some extent, because Trump wants to preserve an America that is, I would say, more homogenous and more stable. And this is one of the problems the left has with him, is he thinks of America as a people. J.D. Vance, he talked about this in his acceptance speech at the RNC. He said that we're not just an idea. And this made some people go a little nuts, even on the right, because it challenges everything that they've been saying for years. But I've noticed a positive shift. And, Harry Jaffa was one of the biggest guys to promote this stuff to the right. And I think he was very destructive in his influence. But people at the Claremont Institute, which is, Harry Jaffa is associated with the Claremont Institute, and the Claremont Institute is very influential. I've noticed a lot of people there, like Larry Arnn and who's the guy that basically runs it? I'm blanking on his name again. But there was another guy there who both made statements that essentially were supporting Vance and trying to reconcile, their beliefs with Vance. And so I see at least a step away from this proposition nation stuff. And I think that's a good thing.
Yeah, the discussion is definitely shifting. Again, I've been into the Civil War as long as I can remember. I've always known Lincoln was the bad guy, so that's been pretty solid for me. But as far as like even hearing the idea of, the proposition nation versus America as a people, that's fairly new to me. That's probably in the last year that has really come across my radar as a discussion. And even reading things by guys like Pat Buchanan, that's, I was a little kid then when he was campaigning for president. I didn't know anything about paleoconservatives versus neocons. So this is all very new for me as a 41-year-old man, kind of coming at it later. And so I do think the discussion is definitely happening now in ways that it never did before.
Michael Anton's a guy that I couldn't remember his name.
Okay. Yeah, I know who Larry Arnn is, but never heard of that other one. So
Michael Anton, essentially runs Claremont Institute. But...
Okay, there you go. I do think, the Republican Party went through sort of a strong libertarian phase. I remember I went through a strong libertarian phase that ended somewhere around 2020. I think COVID shook me up on that a little bit. Why do you think evangelical Christians, I'm trying to think of how to word this best, just as kind of a wrapping up sort of question here, but evangelical Christians, the moral majority, I think did a lot of great things. I'm a big fan of Jerry Falwell. I don't agree. I didn't agree with him politically, or not politically, theologically as a Calvinist. But I saw, even when I was at Liberty, when Jerry Falwell Sr. was still alive, just the influence he had on our community here in Lynchburg, on the nation, as far as having these Christian conversations at a national level. So big fan of Jerry Falwell, big fan of the moral majority, Francis Schaeffer, those guys. But that whole movement almost entirely went down the path of sort of the standard GOP party line neoconservative direction. Why do you think that is, when it does seem like the more paleoconservative, less propositional nation option seems more fitted to creating a Christian society and a Christian culture? That's a big question. You can take it wherever you want. Might be too ambitious for 10 minutes. Let's see.
So I do think that the religious right, of which Falwell was probably, and between him and Pat Robertson is debatable, but Falwell perhaps was the major figure. He was tapping into a populist instinct to reject innovations from the left. The Equal Rights Bill, the abortion. People will say, well, there was this big gap between 1973 and 1979, but I think that some of these policies had to work their way into communities. You don't just magically wave a wand and all of a sudden people are seeing the effects of these policies in their communities. So it takes sometimes a few years. So even, taking prayer out of schools and that kind of thing, that eventually all culminated, I think, in boiling over. And that's really the religious right. Is there's Christians in this country saying we're losing our moorings and our identity and our morality. And I think Falwell made it more and more about morality. And most of those guys did, that Christian values weren't being presented, and perhaps a little less about identity. Now, there was an identity element here in that, they did conceive of America as a very broadly, I suppose, Christian country, or at least had a Christian heritage. But they weren't, you didn't see them, at least from my study, I didn't see them working hard to try to make these institutions or make the country Christian, so much as they wanted to make it moral. And they were willing to work eventually. I should say this is sort of I don't want to, snapshot really what's a 20-year movement here or more, but eventually over time, I think it became more and more about Judeo-Christian values and family values. These are more, general terms. They ended up, I think the Christian Coalition ended up making a bet on, and this is probably a political bet more than anything else. They bet on George Bush over Pat Buchanan in the primaries, and there was a deal struck. And I don't know whether, if you could go back, would Pat Buchanan have gotten the nomination in '92 with their help? I don't know. Maybe. It's hard to say. He was Catholic, though, and they went with someone who was Protestant, but it was probably a bad move. And they ended up, the Republican Party ended up being in bed with much of the religious right for decades, and until it started being questioned by people now who are more on the religious left, and that's the woke stuff that Megan Basham's really unveiling. But I think Trump also, though, Trump was a breaking point in a way, because this coalition had existed for decades, and really what it was evangelicals had their groups, and they would get the pat on the head. We're pro-life, we're this, we're that, but they never really had serious power in the Republican Party. But they had the people at the top felt like they had a seat at the table, and they were appreciated, and that's really all it seemed like they wanted, in my opinion. And then Trump came along, and Trump's not from the Bible Belt. He's not a moral majority guy. He does remember, he's an older guy, so he remembers the United States at a more traditional time, but he comes along and he's a populist, kind of like Buchanan, but not as religious. Right. Buchanan moral issues pretty solid. Trump didn't. But Trump did see that the obvious things, that the country was getting the raw end of the deal when it came to trade and when it came to immigration. And so he really went after those issues hardest, and the Republican establishment wasn't. And so once he gained the nomination and then he won the presidency, this was a moment for evangelicals. They had made this deal with the establishment Republicans, maybe a few of them wanting to now start to, tease the Democrats and see, can you give us a better deal? But most of them were still on board with establishment Republicans. And now there's this guy who's kind of crushed the establishment. And what are they going to do? And most of them have seen him as a threat to some extent. I think over time that has shifted a bit. You have, he has his like faith advisors, and especially a lot of Pentecostal, charismatic, and there's definitely some religious right family organizations that have gone along with this. And like American Family Association would be one, or the Tony Perkins group, I think, has somewhat gone along with this. But they weren't very supportive in the primaries, So as he's become president, there's been a split in the religious right. And we're still dealing with that split even now, I would say. And I think the populists are probably gaining some steam on the Republican side. And with this is questioning things like the Proposition Nation. This is really where the Christian nationalists come from. They're more populists who want to not just conceive of, they don't want Christian values exclusively. They want the nation to conceive of itself as Christian. So it's an identity thing for them. And that's directly in opposition to the Proposition Nation. And they're exclusively on the Trump side. There is no love for Republican establishment with them. So it'll be interesting to see, depending on what happens during the election this year, how that all pans out in the next few years. But you could be watching an ascendancy, perhaps, or the beginnings of a new ascendancy where Christian or evangelical groups are represented by more non-compromising, kind of hardcore anti-Proposition Nation guys. And if guys like William Wolfe and Stephen Wolfe, and it's not really in groups anymore. I mean, the most identifiable group, I suppose, that would be amicable to this is like American Reformer, but we'll have to wait and see if other groups pop up, because there's a lot of demand for it on the popular level.
Good stuff. Well, Jon, thank you for your time. This has been a great conversation. I feel like I've learned a lot while I've been talking to you.
Rick.
So, yeah, good stuff. For those of you watching, check out the 1607 Project. I'll put links in the notes. Also, check out Conversations That Matter. You can listen to Jon talk about political issues and cultural issues there as well. So thanks a lot for being here.
God bless. Thanks, Rick.